Imagine, for a moment, a world where every step forward feels like a battle, where every attempt to rise from the ashes of your past is met with the overwhelming weight of your own brokenness. This is the story of Daniel, a man who thought he had lost everything: his family, his dignity, and his sense of purpose. But sometimes all it takes is the smallest spark, a fragile creature in need, to ignite the long-dormant fire of hope. In the quiet moments between despair and redemption, he discovers the true meaning of healing, not in perfection, but in the struggle to rise again, no matter how many times you fall. Daniel had always been a man of hard edges. The lines on his face were not just from age or wear, but from years of fighting battles, both with others and within himself. His life had never been easy, but it had once been full of hope, full of potential. He had been a father, a husband, someone who could love and believe in the good in the world. He had been someone with a future, someone with a family, but that man, the one who had laughed freely with his daughter, who had held his wife close on quiet nights, no longer existed. That life had crumbled beneath the weight of his addiction and selfishness, brick by brick, until nothing was left but a hollow shell of regret. Daniel had fallen from grace, not in one great, dramatic crash, but in a slow, unrelenting erosion of everything he had ever cared about. The addiction had started small: a drink after work, a pill to take the edge off. It had been so easy to convince himself that it wasn't a problem, that it was just a way to cope, to survive in a world that sometimes felt too heavy to carry. But it quickly became more. Soon, it was the one thing that anchored him to reality, even if that reality was foggy and fleeting. His marriage, once full of love and laughter, began to fray at the seams. His wife, Emma, had begged him to get help. She had cried, pleaded with him to change, but he couldn't or wouldn't. Every promise he made to her, every vow to get better, fell apart as quickly as it was made. In the end, it was his own apathy that had destroyed everything. It wasn't the addiction that pushed Emma away, though it played its part. It was his indifference, his complete lack of care for her, for their daughter, Sophie. Daniel had stopped fighting for them a long time ago. His world had become small, just him and the bottle, him and the pills, him and the empty nights. When Emma had finally left, taking Sophie with her, Daniel didn't fight back. He didn't argue. He didn't beg them to stay. He just watched them go, a hollow ache in his chest, and for the first time, he realized that he had pushed away the only two people who had ever truly loved him, the only ones who had ever believed in him. Now, months later, in the quiet of his small apartment, he sat alone. It was a bleak, dreary place, a small, cramped studio with peeling paint and dirty carpets. It smelled faintly of stale alcohol and the bitter remnants of lost time. The once vibrant photographs on the walls were now faded, out of place in a world that no longer included the faces of his family. Every room felt like a ghost of his former life, reminders of the things he had lost. The couch was threadbare, the kitchen untouched, as if even the dishes had grown tired of waiting for him to care. His apartment reflected the man he had become: empty, forsaken, a shell of what he used to be. But on that gray afternoon, as he wandered the streets, the weight of his past dragging him deeper into despair, something happened that stopped him in his tracks. Something so small, so fragile, that for a brief moment it distracted him from his own misery. As he walked aimlessly, his mind lost in a fog of regret, Daniel's eyes caught a flicker of movement on the sidewalk. At first, he thought it was just another stray animal, another discarded creature struggling to survive. But as he drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. There, lying motionless on the cold concrete, was a small bird. It was a sparrow, barely conscious, its wings crumpled and bent at an unnatural angle. The poor creature seemed to have fallen from the sky, its tiny body trembling from the shock and pain. Its eyes, wide with fear and confusion, stared up at Daniel, who, without thinking, knelt down beside it, his hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work and neglect, hovered over the bird. For a moment, he simply stared at it, at the fragile, broken thing that seemed so small and insignificant in the face of everything he had lost. But then something shifted within him. The Bird's eyes were filled with an urgent kind of vulnerability, something he hadn't seen in himself for a long time. It was not just fear, but something deeper, a plea for help, for care. And in that moment, Daniel felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a need to protect. To care for something that wasn't himself. He slowly reached down, his hands trembling as he cupped the bird gently, trying not to cause it more pain. The bird flinched at first, its tiny body trembling in his palms, but Daniel was careful. For the first time in a long while, he was gentle. The bird's small, fragile form felt like the last connection to something real, something worthy of attention. He lifted it slowly, cradling it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He glanced around, but the street was empty. No one else seemed to care. No one else had stopped to notice the tiny creature lying broken on the pavement. It was just him, Daniel, the man who had long since stopped caring about anything or anyone. He made his way back to his apartment, still cradling the bird in his hands. The street seemed more empty now, the air heavier. He thought about how the bird, just like him, had fallen from grace, how it had been broken, hurt, and abandoned. He thought about how it had no one to protect it, just as he had no one left to protect him. When he got home, he carefully placed the bird in an old shoebox, lining it with soft, worn cloths. He had no idea what he was doing, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had a purpose. It wasn't much, but it was something. The bird needed him, this tiny creature that had no voice to ask for help, no power to defend itself. It needed him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt needed. As the bird nestled into its makeshift nest, Daniel sat back, staring at it. It was fragile, broken, just like him. But perhaps in some small way they could both heal. He watched the bird for a long time, his heart heavy with the weight of his own thoughts. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if he could ever repair the damage he'd done to his own life. But in that moment, with the bird lying so still, so trusting, Daniel made a silent promise to care for it, to do everything in his power to help it heal. Maybe, just maybe, by saving this one small life, he could find a way to save his own. Daniel sat beside the shoebox for hours after he placed the bird inside, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he traced the edges of the torn cloth that lined its makeshift nest. The bird, now gently breathing in shallow, rapid bursts, lay completely still. For a moment, Daniel thought it might be dead. He leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat, and was relieved to see the tiny chest rise and fall. It wasn't much. The bird was a mess, its wing badly damaged, its body thin and fragile. But it was alive, and for reasons Daniel couldn't fully explain, that felt like the most important thing in the world. He'd spent so long numbing himself, drowning in his own failures and regrets, that he'd forgotten what it meant to care. For something, to fight for it, even when it seemed hopeless. The quiet stillness of the apartment was a strange kind of comfort to him now. It was a heavy silence, but it was different. It wasn't the suffocating kind of silence that marked his long, lonely nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering where everything had gone wrong. No, this silence felt like a new beginning. It was the silence of something being nurtured, of something broken being given the chance to heal. Daniel's eyes drifted to the kitchen counter, where the remnants of a meal sat: untouched half-eaten pizza from the night before, a can of soda. He hadn't felt hungry in days, the emptiness in his stomach always something he couldn't quite fill. But as he sat there, watching the bird breathe in slow, rhythmic motions, he realized that the hunger he felt wasn't just physical, it was deeper. He was starving for connection, for meaning, for something that could make him feel whole again. He stood up and wandered over to the counter, grabbing a few slices of bread and some leftover scraps from the fridge. The bird needed nourishment too. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he mashed up a small amount of bread into crumbs and mixed it with some water, he couldn't help but think how absurd it all was. Here he was, a man who had lost everything, trying to care for a broken bird that had fallen from the sky. And yet, in some strange, inexplicable way, this small act of kindness was the most human thing he had done in a long time. After mixing the crumbs into a small, paste-like consistency, Daniel carefully approached the shoebox. The bird was still. lying quietly, but its eyes had softened and there was a faint trace of curiosity in its gaze. It wasn't afraid anymore. Or, at least, it seemed to trust him just a little. He held the small dish up to the bird, trying to gently coax it to eat. "Come on, little guy," Daniel muttered under his breath. "You've got to eat. You've got a long road ahead of you, just like me." The bird didn't react at first, but Daniel wasn't in any rush. He knew it was a slow process. Caring for anything, let alone something as fragile as a bird, required patience. He'd forgotten what patience felt like, had lost it somewhere between his failed promises and his addictions. But as he sat there, waiting, he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't running from the world or numbing himself with substances. He was here, in this moment, taking care of something that needed him, and that perhaps was enough. Hours passed, and Daniel didn't move from the small, worn chair by the shoebox. He talked to the bird, his voice low and comforting, even though he knew it wouldn't understand. He spoke to it about his life, about the mess he'd made of things, about the woman and child he had once loved. The words came easier than he had expected. Somehow, it felt safe, as if the bird was listening and offering no judgment, just a quiet, unwavering presence. Stopped by the end of the day. The bird had eaten a little, its tiny body still too weak to move much. But it had eaten, and that felt like a victory. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling the ache in his legs and back, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that comes from caring for something other than yourself. Over the next few days, Daniel fell into a routine. Every morning, he would check on the bird, gently offering the mashed crumbs mixed with water. He would sit with it, talking softly, letting it know that it wasn't alone. He didn't know why he was doing it, why he felt this strange pull. To keep the bird alive? To see it heal? But there was something about it that was making him change, little by little, each day. The bird's condition improved, if only slightly. The swelling in its wing began to subside, though the limb was still crippled, unable to support flight. It would chirp softly now and again, a small sound that made Daniel's heart ache in the strangest of ways. It was a sound of life, and for once it wasn't just him struggling to survive. Daniel found himself thinking about the bird when he wasn't with it. He would go out to buy more food, stop by a pet store to grab supplies, and for the first time his steps felt purposeful. He wasn't wandering aimlessly anymore. He had a reason to move forward, to do something good, even if it was just caring for a wounded creature. It was something he could control, something he could fix, and as the days turned into weeks, something inside Daniel began to shift. The darkness that had consumed him, the addiction, the loneliness, the regret was still there, lingering at the edges of his thoughts, but it wasn't all-encompassing anymore. When he looked at the bird, the fragile life he was protecting, he saw something else. He saw possibility. He saw that even the smallest of creatures could recover, could heal, could find a way back to life. One night, as he watched the bird settle into its shoebox after a long day, Daniel's mind wandered back to Emma and Sophie. He wondered how they were doing, if they ever thought about him. The guilt twisted in his chest, but he pushed it aside. He had no right to reach out to them, not yet, not until he was sure he was different. But in his heart, he knew that the bird, in some strange way, had opened a door he thought was long closed. It had reminded him that there was still a part of him capable of caring, of loving, of being present. That thought, that tiny spark of hope, was enough to give him a new sense of purpose. The days began to blur together for Daniel, each one passing like the slow, rhythmic movement of the bird's fragile body as it struggled to regain its strength. The early mornings had become a new ritual, one he hadn't expected or planned, but one that filled the gaps where emptiness once lived. He would wake up before the sun had fully risen, walk to the small kitchen, and prepare his modest breakfast, but it was never about the food. It was about the quiet moments before the world outside demanded his attention. It was about something, no matter how small, that made him feel alive. By now, Daniel had settled into a comfortable routine. The birdseeder, as he had started calling it, after the resilient trees that stood tall in the wild, though it was far from strong, yet was eating more each day. Cedar's wing was still broken, the joint too stiff to move properly, but it was clear that the bird was trying. Each day, it would stretch its tiny legs and flap its wings in an awkward, jerky motion, trying to feel the air again. Though it couldn't fly, it was still fighting. And watching Cedar fight made Daniel realize just how much he had stopped fighting for himself. He would often find himself talking to Cedar as he went about his day, pouring his heart out to the bird in ways he never thought he could to anyone else. He told it about Emma, how he had loved her once, how he had lost her when the lies and the addiction had consumed him. He spoke of Sophie, his daughter, and how much he missed her laugh, the way she had always clung to his side when she was small, calling him her hero. He told Cedar about the pain that seemed to surround him, the deep hole he had dug in his heart, and how no matter how many people he pushed away, it never seemed to fill, but for once it felt safe to speak. It wasn't about fixing anything, or asking for forgiveness, it was just releasing the weight, letting it spill out into the room, emptying his chest, even if only for a few moments. Cedar never judged him, never looked away or turned its head in disinterest. It just sat there, perched on the edge of the shoebox, its bright eyes watching him intently, offering what little comfort it could. It was on one of those mornings, as Daniel sat at the small table with his coffee and crumbs of bread for Cedar, that he felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of responsibility. Before, everything in his life had been about him, his needs, his desires, his pain. But now, there was something that needed him. Something that couldn't ask for help, something too small to survive without him. He stood up and moved toward Cedar, watching as the bird lifted its head toward him as if sensing his presence. "You're getting stronger, huh?" Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I could help anyone, but I think I'm starting to learn." The bird blinked at him, its small body still trembling slightly from its wounds, but it had made it through another day. And with each day, Daniel realized it was becoming something more than just a creature to him. Cedar was a reminder that things could change, that growth, even slow and painful, was possible. Maybe he could grow too. He hadn't thought about attending his recovery meetings in days. The thought of sitting in a circle, surrounded by people who would judge him, ashamed of his own failures, had always felt overwhelming. But with Cedar by his side, somehow the thought didn't seem so impossible anymore. Maybe it was time to try again. For both of them, that afternoon, Daniel took a deep breath and made the call. The familiar voice on the other end of the line seemed distant at first, but as he spoke, the words felt like they had been waiting inside him, desperate for an outlet. I need to come back," he said, his voice shaky but sure. "I think I'm ready." The next few days passed in a haze of small victories and slow realizations. Daniel kept attending meetings, but something had shifted each time he walked into that circle. The faces around him didn't seem quite as intimidating as before. There was no judgment, only understanding, something he hadn't thought he deserved. The members had all shared their struggles, their darkest moments, and yet they still found a way to move forward. For the first time, Daniel realized that redemption wasn't an isolated event. It was a constant effort, a choice made again and again. He had been given a chance, a real chance, and he didn't want to waste it, but Cedar wasn't just a passive observer in Daniel's journey. The bird, with its fragile body and broken wing, became a constant source of inspiration. Every time Daniel saw Cedar stretch its wings, no matter how pitiful the attempt, he saw a reflection of himself, the man who had been broken, but who wasn't beyond repair. Every day, Cedar's little victories felt like Daniel's own, and with each ounce of progress the bird made, Daniel felt like he, too, was healing. One small step at a time. The bird's wings still hadn't healed enough to let it fly, but it could walk now. Cedar would hop across the box, tiny feet patting softly on the cloth, flapping its wings in small, hopeful bursts. It wasn't much, but it was something. Daniel marveled at how quickly the bird was learning to adapt to its new limitations, how, despite everything, it didn't give up. It was a lesson in resilience, one that Daniel had needed more than he realized. He began to notice small things about himself, too. The hollow feeling in his stomach had begun to fade. He didn't feel the same compulsion to drown himself in alcohol at night. Instead, he spent those hours with Cedar, reading old books, letting the bird listen to his voice as he read aloud. Sometimes he'd put on music just to fill the silence, and the bird would sit, content, on its perch, listening intently. It was a strange kind of companionship, one born of necessity, not choice, but somehow it worked. Daniel's apartment, once cold and empty, now felt warmer. The air felt lighter, even though the weight of his past still clung to him. Every morning, when he would check on Cedar, there was a small flicker of hope in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to numb himself. He was trying to heal. And Cedar, in its own quiet way, had shown him that healing was possible. It was slow, painful, uncertain, but it was possible. One evening, as Daniel sat on the floor near the shoebox, watching Cedar take tiny, shaky steps, across the cloth, he whispered to the bird, "We're getting there, aren't we?" Cedar blinked up at him, as if acknowledging the quiet truth. Slowly, it began to preen its ruffled feathers, cleaning itself with its beak. And for Daniel, the sight felt like a miracle. He wasn't fully healed yet. Neither was Cedar, but they were getting there, together. For the first time in a long while was enough. The days had become a blur of routine. Daniel's life, once ruled by chaotic bursts of addiction, had slowed to a quiet, almost methodical pace. Every day he would rise early, check on Cedar, and start his morning with the same ritual: a cup of coffee, a slice of bread for the bird, and a few minutes of silence before the world outside demanded his attention. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a life he could live, small and simple, but real. As the weeks passed, Cedar had begun to make more noticeable progress. The bird was stronger now, its wings more limber, though it still couldn't fly. Cedar would hop across the box, flapping its wings a little more forcefully, as though testing them. The bird had even started to chirp in the mornings, its tiny voice a delicate sound that filled the apartment with a kind of warmth. It felt like a quiet victory, one that made Daniel's heart ache with something he couldn't quite name. But even with the progress, something lingered in the back of Daniel's mind, a nagging sense that, no matter how far Cedar had come, the bird was still fragile, still broken. And in that fragility, Daniel saw his own reflection. He too was healing, but the wounds of his past were far from gone. His mistakes, his regrets, his addiction, those things didn't just disappear. They still clung to him, like shadows reminding him of who he had been, of what he had lost. But the more he cared for Cedar, the more he saw that healing was a journey, not a destination. One evening, as Daniel sat in his usual spot on the floor beside Cedar's shoebox, he noticed something strange. The bird, who had been hopping and fluttering around for hours, suddenly stopped moving. It perched on the edge of the box, its wings drooping, and it looked up at Daniel with those wide, bright eyes. But there was something different about its gaze. The change in Cedar was subtle, but it was there. Something was wrong. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the bird's soft feathers. Cedar's body was warm, but it felt unnaturally still. It wasn't the same feisty little creature that had been eagerly eating from his hand just hours ago. It looked exhausted. "Cedar?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. The bird didn't respond, just sat there, unmoving. It had become so much more than just a pet to him. Cedar had become his reason to move forward, the small anchor that kept him from spiraling back into the darkness. For a brief moment, Daniel's mind spun with worry. He was afraid that he had failed the bird in some way. He had tried to do everything right. He had given it food, warmth, companionship, but still, Cedar wasn't healing completely. It wasn't enough. He knelt beside the shoebox, his hands shaking as he gently picked Cedar up. The bird seemed to tremble in his hands, and his heart twisted painfully in his chest. "Please don't go," Daniel murmured, his voice rough. He wasn't sure if he was talking to Cedar or to himself. There was something about the bird's fragility, something about the way it seemed to trust him so completely that made the weight of his past come crashing down. He wasn't just trying to save a broken creature. He was trying to save himself too. He had been so focused on the idea of helping Cedar heal, of guiding it through its recovery, that he hadn't realized how much he too was still broken. His past was like a deep wound that would never fully close. His heart, like Cedar's wings, would always bear the marks of the pain it had endured, with Cedar gently cradled in his palms. Daniel slowly moved to the couch and sat down, the bird nestled close to his chest. The stillness in the room was almost suffocating, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. He closed his eyes, letting the silence wash over him, wishing that he could find a way to make everything better for both of them. It was in that moment, sitting on the couch with the bird pressed against his chest, that Daniel realized something. There were no guarantees in life. There was no promise of perfect healing, no promise that the past could ever be fully erased. Cedar might not make it, and Daniel knew deep down that his recovery would be just as uncertain. But that didn't mean there wasn't hope. It didn't mean that there wasn't a reason to keep going, to keep trying. He looked down at Cedar, his fragile little life resting so trustingly in his hands. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" Daniel whispered softly, his voice breaking. "I know the feeling. I know what it's like to feel broken, but you're not alone anymore. You don't have to do this by yourself." For the first time, Daniel understood what it meant to truly care about someone or something again. It wasn't about saving them from every pain, from every moment of struggle. It was about being there with them, standing beside them in the quiet moments, the fragile ones, the ones where everything could go wrong. It was about showing up, even when you didn't have all the answers, even when you were scared of losing what you loved. Cedar's breathing remained shallow, but it had calmed. The little bird seemed to relax in his arms, perhaps sensing that Daniel was there, perhaps sensing the silent promise he had made. No matter what happened, Daniel wasn't going to give up, not on the bird, not on himself. He stayed like that for what felt like hours, cradling Cedar, letting the room fill with the gentle sound of their shared silence. Time seemed to stretch. And for once, Daniel wasn't rushing. He wasn't looking for a way out or a quick fix. He was simply present, simply existing in the quiet bond between him and the fragile creature in his arms. It was late when Daniel finally stood, carefully, placing Cedar back into its shoebox. The bird was still too weak to move much, but its eyes followed him as he stepped back, and in those eyes, Daniel saw something that filled him with both sorrow and hope. Cedar wasn't giving up. Neither was he. As the night stretched on, Daniel stayed close to the bird, watching over it. He didn't know if Cedar would survive. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But one thing had become clear: even in the most fragile of moments, there was still a chance for healing, and maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed to believe in again. The next morning, when Daniel woke up, the apartment was quiet, as it always was. But as he moved toward the shoebox, he noticed something different. Cedar, though still weak, was sitting up, its eyes wide and alert. Its breathing, while still labored, was steadier than before. Daniel's heart lifted just a little. The bird wasn't giving up. And neither was he. As he knelt beside the shoebox, gently reaching out to offer Cedar food, he whispered, "You're not alone. We're in this together." In that moment, Daniel knew one thing for certain: healing wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, day after day, even when the path ahead seemed unclear. It was about choosing to believe, despite the uncertainty, despite the pain. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the first stirrings of hope. The sun had risen high over the city, casting a warm golden light across the apartment as Daniel stood in the kitchen, staring out the window. The sky was clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged inside him for so many years. He wasn't sure how long it had been since he'd started caring for Cedar, but in that moment it felt like a lifetime. His mind often drifted back to the man he used to be, the one trapped in the endless spiral of addiction and regret. But that version of him felt distant now, like a shadow from another life. The present was where he stood uncertain, but resolute. It had been a week since Cedar had collapsed in his hands, and although the bird had continued to improve since that moment, Daniel's sense of fear hadn't quite dissipated. He knew the fragility of life now. He knew what it felt like to care for something that might not make it. But what he had come to realize in those silent hours beside Cedar was that the act of caring, of showing up, even when it felt impossible, was the key to moving forward. It was the key to redemption, even if it was just for one tiny, broken bird. Cedar was perched at the edge of the shoebox, his wings flapping weakly, but with more strength than the last time Daniel had seen him try. There was still no flight, not yet, but the bird was doing something it hadn't done before. It was trying. It was struggling, yes, but it was refusing to give up. Daniel watched the bird closely, his heart aching as he thought of his own battles. His past would never completely fade, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to. Maybe he didn't have to escape it. Maybe he just had to learn to live with it. With every small victory Cedar achieved, Daniel felt a little stronger. Cedar had shown him that healing wasn't linear, it didn't happen overnight. It was a process filled with ups and downs, progress and setbacks. But as long as you kept moving, kept trying, there was always hope. After a few moments of quiet reflection, Daniel approached the shoebox and sat down beside it. Cedar chirped softly, tilting its head as if it sensed his presence. The bird's body was still weak, but the fire in its eyes, the same fire Daniel had seen in himself all those weeks ago, was stronger now. It wasn't the same bird he had found on that street corner, broken and vulnerable. This bird was alive. It was fighting. And so was Daniel. He gently extended his hand, offering the bird a small piece of bread soaked in water. Cedar hesitated for a moment before hopping forward, its tiny beak reaching out to peck at the food. As the bird ate, Daniel couldn't help but smile. There was something deeply symbolic in the way Cedar was learning to live again. Something that resonated with Daniel on a level he hadn't expected. "You're stronger than you know, Daniel," whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Cedar's tiny eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, the two of them seemed to share a quiet understanding. They were both broken. They were both scarred. But they were still here. Daniel had been to several more recovery meetings since that night of Cedar's collapse. Each time, he felt a little less afraid to face his past. The people in those circles had become more than just voices to him. They had become a kind of family, people who understood what it meant to be lost, to make mistakes, and to still try to move forward. The shame that had once defined him no longer held him captive. He wasn't the man he had been, and though he still bore the scars, he was learning to live with them. But it wasn't until that morning, as he sat watching Cedar eat from his hand, that he fully understood the lesson that the bird had been teaching him all along, the lesson of survival, of resilience, of redemption. Daniel stood up and moved to the window, gazing out at the world beyond. The sun hung high in the sky, casting its golden rays over the city, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the world lift just a little. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He had a choice. The sound of Cedar flapping its wings behind him drew Daniel's attention back to the shoebox. The bird had managed to lift itself off the ground, its wings trembling as it hovered for a moment before settling back down, exhausted but alive. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The bird hadn't flown yet, but it was trying again. Trying harder than ever before. With a small smile on his face, Daniel crouched down to meet Cedar's gaze. "You're not alone, little guy," he said softly. "I'm here." But even as the words left his lips, he realized something profound. Cedar had never been truly alone, neither had he. They were both survivors, both in the process of healing. And they had done it together. That evening, after spending hours in the recovery meetings and reflecting on his progress, Daniel returned home to find Cedar still perched near the edge of the shoebox. The bird's movements were slower, and its breathing a little more labored than usual, but it was still there, still alive, still fighting. And in that quiet moment, as the sky outside darkened and the apartment grew still, Daniel made a decision. He would not let Cedar's healing be in vain. He would not let his own recovery falter. He would keep fighting, just as the bird had. Every setback, every failure, every painful reminder of the man he once was, he would face them all with Cedar by his side, there was a kind of quiet strength that he hadn't known he possessed. He took a deep breath and reached for the bird, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted it from the shoebox. Cedar's feathers felt soft and fragile in his palms, and for a moment, Daniel thought about all the things that could go wrong. But he didn't dwell on them. He simply held Cedar close, his heart filled with gratitude for the small creature who had shown him what it meant to keep moving forward. No matter how difficult the journey, "Thank you," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for showing me how to fight again." It wasn't much, but it was enough. The bird chirped softly in his hands, a small, quiet sound that echoed the hope Daniel now carried in his heart. He wasn't fully healed, he wasn't perfect. But in that moment, he understood the most important thing of all. Redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about continuing to try, even when everything seemed broken. It was about showing up. Every single day, even when it felt impossible. As Daniel stood there, cradling Cedar gently in his hands, he realized that the bird wasn't just a symbol of hope, it was his guide. It had shown him that, no matter how small the steps, healing was possible. He wasn't going to give up on himself, not anymore, and with that, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the apartment filled with the quiet peace of the night, Daniel felt a flicker of something in his chest, something that had been missing for so long. Hope. If you've ever felt broken, if you've ever been lost in the darkness of your own mistakes, know that healing is possible. Like Daniel and Cedar, we all have our scars, but they don't define us, they shape us. No matter how fragile, no matter how small the hope, it is worth fighting for. Take that first step. Embrace the fight for your own redemption. Don't wait for the world to hand you healing. Create it, piece by piece, day by day. The wings of your recovery may still tremble, but with every flap, you're getting closer to flight. Now, it's your turn. Will you choose to rise,